Hi, my name is Tom Solomon, and I'm here with the New Mexico chapter of 350.org to give you a little bit of climate hope. Some hope that there really is a way to build ourselves out of the current climate crisis and into a clean, renewable energy future. And we're going to start with some great work that's been done at Stanford University by Professor Mark Jacobson, who is the head of their Atmosphere and Energy program at Stanford. And what he's done is documented a clean energy vision for the year 2050 with 100% renewable energy for all purposes. And you can find his work on a website called thesolutionsproject.org. And he has taken all the various renewable energy sources available to us in the United States and analyzed what's available for every state in the union. And there is actually a customized version of that solution for every state that you can find on that website. But if you add up all of those various parts of the solution and the various aspects of clean renewable energy available to us, you end up with what you can see on the screen there, which is about 50% wind, 45% solar, and the remaining portions, some hydroelectric, geothermal, and wave and tidal energy. And every part of the country has a different mix of those renewable energy resources. For example, in the Northeast and the Northwest, great hydroelectric resources because of all the rainfall there. In the American Southwest, we have tremendous sun and solar resources. The central plains of the country have a great amount of wind energy resources. In the West, again, a lot of geothermal. And of course, off of both coasts and in the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of offshore wind is available. And so every state, as I said, has a different mix of those renewable energy resources, and we're going to figure out how to take his vision and couple it with a plan to build out all of the renewable energy that we need to achieve that vision and to do it in time to avoid the worst effects of global warming. And that's the plan that I'm going to share with you today. The key messages that I want you to come away with today are that 100% clean renewable energy, that future can really be achieved with our current technology. We do not require any energy miracles to get there. We just need to build a whole lot of what we know how to build today. And we can pay for all of that investment with the fuel savings that we're going to have by no longer buying fossil fuels, and at the same time we're going to be creating some really great jobs in the country, more jobs than we have today as we depend on fossil fuels. And that future is going to be far healthier than burning fossil fuels and breathing in the pollution that we get from that, which causes a lot of disease in terms of health, lung disease, and heart disease. And so that's the key message for today. And we're going to answer these questions. Why is this urgent? How are we going to build all of this clean energy? How much is it going to cost, and how will we pay for it? And as an example of a particular state, how would we do this in the state of New Mexico? So let's start with why we have to achieve 100% clean renewable energy. And the reason is because our current course is really a titanic disaster. We are literally headed towards the end of human civilization if we continue on the path that we're on today. And here's the reason why. The current levels of carbon dioxide are now higher than they have been at any time in human history. We know this because there are trapped air bubbles in ice cores that they've dug from ancient glaciers, and they can analyze the CO2 content in those dissolved air bubbles. And we can plot the level of CO2 all the way back for about 800,000 years, far longer than modern humans have evolved on the planet. And during that time, we basically maintained the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the primary global warming gas. We maintained that at a level of somewhere between 150 and 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that maintained the Earth with a relatively stable climate. Well, today we are far higher than at any time in human history at about 400 parts per million. And the forecast for the end of the century are potentially as high as 900 parts per million, which would quite literally lead us to a planet that is so hot we would no longer be able to grow the food to support the level of human population that we have on the planet today. And so that is one of the real things that we want to avoid. And we are already seeing the results of the warming from the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere so far. This is a chart from NASA. 2015 was the warmest year that we have ever seen since we started keeping temperature records. The warmest year before that was in 2014, and 2016 is shaping up to be another record temperature year. Again, it will be the warmest year on record. So the warming is already happening. One of the primary ways that we know the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is from an instrument put on the top of Mauna Loa Observatory in the Hawaiian Islands at about 11,000 feet, where you can get a really nice clean signal of CO2 in the atmosphere. It was started there in 1958 by Dr. Charles Keeling, and you can see the dark red portion of that curve on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the actual real-time data they've been collecting on CO2 levels at that observatory. And the reason I mention this is because you can just take that curve and extrapolate the curve forward just a few years until you hit 450 parts per million. And the reason why 450 is important is because that's the level that scientists tell us correlate to a full 2 degrees C of warming of the planet, which is what all governments have said we must avoid if we want to avoid the most dangerous consequences of climate change. We will, on our current path, hit 450 parts per million at about the year 2034. And it's a simple extrapolation that you can do on this curve. Other scientists have done much more in-depth analysis of this and basically come to similar conclusions somewhere around the 2030 mid-decade, plus or minus a couple of years. And so in order to avoid that kind of a future with 2 degrees C of dangerous warming, what we need to do with this curve is bend the level of CO2 in the atmosphere and flatten it out before we hit to 450. And hopefully do it in time to avoid even 1.5 degrees C of warming, which is what the Paris Climate Conference said that we must do. If we don't do that, we will end up with some of the results that you can see on this page, which was published in the National Climate Assessment that was generated by a whole slew of government agencies, including the Department of Agriculture, the State Department, NASA, NOAA, and the Pentagon, that said that the path that we are on gives us in the US Southwest a temperature on average that will be by the year 2070, 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than we are today. That's 4.4 degrees Celsius, with terrible consequences in terms of drought, reduced surface water supply, reduced crop yields, wildfires, disease outbreaks, and damaging extreme weather events. And so the path that we are on leads us to this kind of a future, something that we should do everything in our power to avoid. And that's the purpose of my talk here today, is to show you a path out of that climate crisis so that we can avoid that future. And what we're going to do is to start with the vision that Professor Jacobson sketched out for the year 2050, 100% clean renewable energy. We'll follow the mandate out of the Paris Climate Conference that said that we must try to avoid not only 2 degrees C, but even 1.5 degrees C of total warming. And the consequence of that, that mandate is that we really need to keep 80% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. And we will pay for all of this by the savings that we'll realize by no longer spending money on fossil fuels, the coal, oil, natural gas, et cetera, that we are currently spending about $875 billion a year as a US economy to buy and burn and to warm the planet. And we're going to do all that and couple it with that plan to realize Professor Jacobson's vision, and it turns out to do it before the year 2040. And the reason we have to do it is because doing nothing and thinking that we can keep our current climate is not a choice available to us. So how do we actually achieve his vision? So we start with the Solutions Project, data that's been published, for example, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And his vision says that The end-use power consumption of the United States by the year 2050 will be something like 1,591 gigawatts of power for all purposes. And that's not just electricity. That is heating, that's industrial uses of power, that's ground, sea, and air transportation, that is everything. We will no longer be burning fossil fuels, period. But of course, in order to actually consume that energy as end-use customers, we will need to build more than that, because of course we know that renewable sources of energy like wind and solar are intermittent. Solar panels only generate power during the day, and while wind is always blowing somewhere on the continent, not every wind turbine is burning all of the time. And so there's something called the capacity factor, which is the percentage of time that a renewable energy resource is generating its rated power output. And we use capacity factors for solar averaging around 22%, for wind power about 33%. If you apply those capacity factors towards the 1,591 gigawatts of end use, you calculate that we will need to actually install nameplate generation capacity of about 6,448 gigawatts to install. 60% of that will be solar, 40% or so will be wind, and about 1% or 61 gigawatts will be the remaining geothermal, wave power, tidal, and a little bit of additional hydroelectric. And so that is our challenge. How can we build that much clean renewable energy in time? And here's how. For the next 22 years, from now through 2037, on average, the United States would need to install 597 million solar panels a year, 21,000 wind turbines a year, at a total cost of the economy of something like $283 billion. And if you add that up over the course of those 22 years, that is a total spending bill of about $6.3 trillion. That's a big number. And it's also about the same amount of money that we spent on the cost of the Iraq and Afghan wars, if you include the costs of the medical bills of the returning veterans. So we have experience spending that kind of money as an economy, and we can do it again. This is what that build out would look like as we move from our current situation, depending upon fossil fuels, towards 100% clean renewable energy future. And we would end up building out that 6,448 gigawatts of renewable energy and targeting 50% of that build out for the year 2030, because that's what the result of the Paris Climate Conference said we need to achieve in order to avoid 1.5 degrees C of warming. So 50% by 2030. And it turns out that if you target and achieve 50% of that build out by 2030, you will have so much manufacturing capacity for solar panels and wind turbines in place that if you just leave those existing factories at capacity running for another 7 years, you'll reach 100% by 2037. And here's how that works. That previous chart showed you what the increase in renewable energy that was online and how that was built out from now through 2037. This page shows you the rate at which we will need to be adding that renewable energy every year as we go forward. And we are starting from a very low baseline, because last year, 2015, we installed as a country about 16 gigawatts of wind and solar. It was about half and half. We will have to get to the point in order to achieve 50% by 2030, where we are adding up to 488 gigawatts per year of renewable energy capacity online on our system. To get there, we will need to build about 29 solar and wind factories every year for a couple of decades. So if you assume that each one of those factories puts out about 1 gigawatt of power each, then this chart also represents the number of 1 gigawatt factories that have to be available online producing those panels and wind turbines every year. 60% of them will be solar, 40% for wind turbines, each factory producing 1 gigawatt of output of those panels and turbines every year. That is a total of building 488 factories during the course of 22 years. And as I said, as you see where we get to 50% by 2030, we are almost done building all of those factories, and they are producing an enormous amount of output, 488 gigawatts a year. If you let those factories just continue to produce at that level from 2030 through 2037, you will be at 100% by 2037. And of course, we know that wind turbines and solar panels have something like a 25 to 30-year lifetime, so there will be a period of time, 25 to 30 years after we start, where we will need to replace them again, just as you do with all aging power plants. Here is what the costs and investments and savings look like for that scenario. Now remember, I said that we were spending $875 billion a year as an economy buying fossil fuels and burning it to power our civilization, but also to warm the planet. Well, for every 10% of renewable energy that you put online, that represents about 10% of that, or $88 billion a year in savings in no longer purchasing those fossil fuels. So as you begin to do the investment up front in this renewable energy scenario, it is just like a home that has bought solar panels for their roof to end up with no electric bill. As a country, we will have to invest in lots of solar panels and lots of wind turbines, but you have to build it up front in order to begin to realize the savings in reduced spending on fossil fuels. And that's what this looks like. What it shows is that by about the year 2029, we will be at a point where we're now have invested so much in renewable energy that we will be saving as much every year as we will need to continue to invest in the renewable energy build-out. Now, the net burden on the economy during that time, from now till 2029, is about $29 billion a year. And that is the difference between the investment that we have to make every year and the savings in fuel that we'll realize as we go forward. So about $95 billion a year is the net burden on the economy through 2029. And of course, after 2029, the savings will continue to grow into amount until when we're done by 2037, we will be saving all of that $875 billion a year, every year as an economy. And that is more money in your pocket and mine. So the question then arises, where could this money come from? Where could this money come from to invest in this renewable energy? Well, a couple of possibilities. One is a carbon tax. Carbon tax has been proposed by organizations such as the Citizens Climate Lobby. In their model, it's called fee and dividend, and it's actually revenue neutral. So all of the money that we collect in taxes is returned to the citizens in the form of a dividend. The benefit of a carbon tax is that it redirects the incentives to private industry by taxing the pollution that they generate and actually give them an economic incentive to, instead of investing in fossil fuels as they have been, to invest in clean renewable energy. And for an example, the oil industry during the course of 2008 to 2014 spent and wasted $5.4 trillion looking for additional sources of oil production and in expanding their capacity. And of course, we cannot let them burn that additional fossil fuel that they've discovered, because we already know that 80% of what we've already discovered has to stay in the ground. So that is completely wasted investment. And as a side benefit to them, the price of oil crashed, and it had destroyed a lot of their businesses, and many of those companies are going to be going out of business. If you compare that $5.4 trillion wasted spending over 8 years to the sum that we need to spend over the course of 22 years, $6.3 trillion, to build out the complete wind and solar renewable energy infrastructure, it is a very easy comparison to make those two. So what you want to do is impose something like a carbon tax on private industry to realign the incentives so that they invest in what will actually make the money going forward, which is clean renewable energy. Another possibility would be to impose a gas tax. If you remember, back in 2014, we were all paying up to $3.50 a gallon for gas. The price of oil went down, the price of gas went down, and is now less than $2 a gallon. We could easily impose a $1 a gallon gas tax, which would realize for the revenue side of $137 billion a year, because that's how many gallons we consume in this country, 137 billion gallons every year. And that $137 billion a year would go a long way towards paying the bill for the investment in renewable energy that we need to make to achieve this vision. So let's take a look in some more detail at what the individual solutions would look like, starting with solar power. Remember, we needed to build out about 60% of that total renewable energy in solar. And the good news is that the first one of those gigafactories, those big solar panel factories putting out 1,000 or 1 gigawatt per year of solar panels, is being built right now in Buffalo, New York by Solar City. It goes online in July of 2016 and will be at full production in July of 2017. It's about $5 billion investment to build the plant, created 5,000 jobs during construction. And they're building some pretty high efficiency solar cells, so they will be putting out 300-watt solar panels. This is the first of the factories that we need to build, and we'll need to build 295 similar factories through 2029 to get there. This chart shows you in pretty dramatic form what the dramatic reduction in price for solar has looked like over the past several years. This is a chart showing the cost per unit energy for coal and natural gas and oil and liquefied natural gas, and it's been bumping along at about $5 to $20 per unit of energy up until very recently. And we never actually even saw solar on this chart until 8 years ago. But 8 years ago, it showed up on the very end of the curve, and the price reduction that solar has been seeing since that time has been absolutely dramatic, and it has plunged down to the point where it is now below the cost of oil, and it is approaching in many states being cheaper than coal or natural gas. And this is a chart put together by a financial organization called AllianceBernstein, April 2014. If you take a look at the more recent time frame, just since the year 2000, and really even closer to the present since 2009, we have been seeing the installed costs of solar PV systems dropping at 7% per year. And we were seeing those cost reductions for solar during a time when we were installing less than 5 gigawatts of solar per year. In the future that we're talking about during this build out, we will be installing 200 to 300 gigawatts per year and spending something like $158 billion a year on this industry. And you can bet that competitive pressures will make sure that all of the solar companies, the dozens of them out there, will be competing with each other on price, driving their costs to continue to get lower and lower so that they can get a good piece of that $150 billion a year business every year. And I think the only question will be is if this price decline actually happens faster than that. But in my model, I just assume that the price of installed costs of solar would continue at the current rate of 7% per year. Solar is already taking off, and the solar industry is forecasting a whopping 119% growth in solar panel installs in the US in the year 2016. So we're already starting to see a lot of this happening. Let's take a look at the wind power solution. So wind energy was going to be about 40% of our solution. It's that blue section on the top of this graph. And again, we are targeting 50% of that wind capacity to be on by the year 2030. What we're going to need to do is a tremendous expansion in our ability to generate and install wind power, however. The greatest number of gigawatts ever installed in the US so far was 13 gigawatts in the year 2012. And we're going to need to increase that rate of wind power installations by a factor of 15 to the point where we're installing 193 gigawatts per year through that build-out time frame through 2037. And that amounts to that number that I gave you before, 21,000 wind turbines a year on average of 5 megawatt wind turbines. The good news again in wind turbine pricing is that those prices are also coming down for a number of reasons. Price competition as the market grows and the volumes rise. Better designs of generators and the turbines and the blades. And the wind turbines are getting taller and taller and taller. A 5 megawatt wind turbine, the hub height is something like 90 meters. So almost a full football field up in height. And of course, the wind blows faster the farther away from the surface that you go, so you get better wind production with those larger turbines. What I used for my cost projections was a study that came out of the International Energy Agency forecasting another 30% reduction in price by the year 2030, and that gets you wind costs that go down somewhere near $1 a watt by the end of the build-out. So what I think is some fairly conservative cost projections. Here's some more good news. As we proceed through this build-out of renewable energy, we're going to create a lot of jobs. And this is some data from the World Bank. What they show is that for every $1 million of spending versus the oil, coal, and gas industry, where we see maybe from 5 to 7 jobs per million, in the wind and solar industry, you see 13 to 14 jobs per million. So lots of good jobs to be created as we go through this renewable energy transition. And a factor that a lot of people wonder about, and Professor Jacobson answered, was what is the land footprint of all of this renewable energy as you build it out? Well, here it is on the chart. And the final answer is about 0.4% of US land area will be used for all of that clean renewable energy generation. Of course, the hydroelectric dams are largely already built, and rooftop solar doesn't use up any additional land that's already being used because those are existing roofs. Offshore wind, of course, has no land footprint. The largest land footprint is going to be from the utility scale photovoltaic and concentrated solar power plants, and it's that white dot that's just shown concentrated in Texas, but of course it would be distributed around the country. And then for onshore wind, if you were to include the total impact of an entire wind farm, including the spacing in between all of those wind towers, it would be that larger tan circle in the middle there. But if you just include where the base of the wind turbine towers hit the ground, it's that little red dot in the middle. So if you add all of that up, again, a tiny land footprint for 100% clean renewable energy. It's also important to keep in mind that this land footprint isn't considered in a vacuum. You need to compare it to the land and sea impact that we're already seeing with fossil fuels, from oil and gas extraction to mountaintop mining removal for coal mines and other strip mines for coal, and of course the tremendous damage that we did in the Gulf of Mexico with the Deep Horizon spill that nearly destroyed the ocean ecosystem in that Gulf. All of that goes away, and those impacts can be cleaned up in a 100% clean renewable energy future. So that was the picture for the entire country as a whole. If you zoom down and say, what would it look like to build out renewable energy in the state of New Mexico, you end up with this. So this blue infographic that you see on the screen is something that is on the Solutions Project website for every state in the union. This is the one, of course, for New Mexico. And if you add up all of the individual pieces of solar, from residential rooftop to commercial to utility scale solar, it adds up to be about 40% solar, 50% wind for New Mexico, and because New Mexico has got some pretty good geothermal resources, about 10% would be for geothermal. And if we were to install only the power that we consume within the state of New Mexico, not exporting power outside of the state borders, which of course we should, given our tremendous abundance of wind and solar resources, through 2037, we would be installing about, 213 wind turbines a year and about 2.5 million solar panels. And the cost would be $1.7 billion a year, which includes that 10% for geothermal. And a possible way to pay for it, again, would be at this $1 a gallon gas tax. So applied just to our consumption within the state of New Mexico, that could generate up to $978 million a year. And we would also see about 30,000 jobs created for this clean renewable energy future, and a lot of health benefits, which we'll talk about shortly. New Mexico as a state is one of 20 states that are already at what's called grid parity, meaning it is literally cheaper to take out a loan and install solar panels on your roof and end up with no electric bill than it is to continue to buy power from your electric utility. 20 states in the union are already in that condition of grid parity. And in just 4 short years in the future, by the year 2020, 42 states will be at grid parity. This is a measure of the continued reduction in the cost of solar power. And another benefit to solar power for the state of New Mexico is that it gives us a great solar industry. We already have in the state of New Mexico 102 solar companies generating almost 1,900 solar industry jobs in an industry that's growing 12% per year with great wages. A median wage for an installer is about $20 an hour. And you can find this information in the Solar Foundation for every state in the union. This is the one for New Mexico. So great jobs in the solar industry, providing good benefit and a lot of growth in the state of New Mexico. And the state of New Mexico and then the Southwest, as we said, has tremendous solar resources. You can see what this map looks like, concentrated in the Southwest, but every state has good solar energy. Wind resources concentrated in the Central Plains, sometimes called the Saudi Arabia of wind, but also in the state of New Mexico, in the Eastern Plains, a good concentrated area where we can see good wind production. And we've already started to install wind there, and we should continue. And geothermal resources for the country are on this map. Colorado has a tremendous concentration, but also in the state of New Mexico, especially along the Rio Grande Valley, plenty of geothermal, and that's why 10% of the solution for renewable energy in New Mexico is geothermal. If you take all of those benefits and put it on a little infographic, which we did, you end up with this: 50% solar, 50% wind, 10% geothermal, 40% solar, creating about 30,000 jobs. The cost of electricity goes down by about 10%. And we will also realize, in terms of health benefits, something like a savings of $2.4 billion a year and 353 fewer deaths per year from the reduction in the pollution from burning fossil fuels. So that was the story of the build-out of 100% clean renewable energy in the country. But other things, of course, will need to change to go along with that. We will need to completely electrify transportation. We'll need electric cars, electric trucks and trains. We'll need renewable energy transportation for air and sea. Professor Jacobson's solution is to use compressed cryogenic hydrogen that we use by cracking water into oxygen and hydrogen. Another possible alternative is to use algae-based biofuels, of which there is actually a plant here in New Mexico called Sapphire Energy. They're based around Las Cruces, and they have an algae biofuel plant today with a contract with the US military. We'll also need to convert building heating, cooling, and hot water to renewables, and we will need a smart grid with some storage to handle the intermittent renewable energy sources. And the cost for that is typically estimated somewhere around $400 billion, or about $20 billion a year in additional spending for 20 years. And then finally, we'll need to invest in that last 1% that is not wind and solar for the remaining geothermal, wave, and hydro to finish up that build out. So in summary, we will need to produce the solution, which is technically within our grasp. The resistance to doing it is political, it is not technical. The resistance to doing it, of course, comes from the sectors of the economy that will no longer be realizing that $875 billion a year. We can clearly withstand the costs, which are on the order of the same amount of spending we did for the Iraq and Afghan wars. And the industrial challenge of doing this is a mighty one. It is clearly a large task, and it is on the order of the industrial challenge that we had during World War II to convert our economy to wartime footing, to building tanks and airplanes and artillery pieces. But we did that conversion in 2 years, from 1941 to 1943. So finally, if we were going to embark on this renewable energy solution, what do we have to do first? So of course, as individuals, we should make sure to conserve as much energy as we can by replacing our light bulbs with LEDs, for example, and insulating our homes and buying a good mileage car or maybe an electric vehicle. But in terms of a policy change, one of the most important things we can do is to push our electric utilities to shut down their coal and gas-fired power plants, replace them with wind and solar and other renewables. And we do this by telling our state legislatures to increase the renewable portfolio standards to 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And that's what we need to do to realize the renewable energy future that is required in order to save the climate. And we can do this. Thank you.